First-class passenger insults black woman. Then she reveals she's an undercover air marshal. High above the clouds, where the hum of jet engines drowns out ordinary worries, the most unexpected confrontations can unfold. People think first-class cabins are serene enclaves of luxury, but appearances can be deceiving. In the glow of overhead lights, personal biases simmer alongside champagne flutes, waiting for the slightest spark. When a smug passenger in a tailored suit singled out a dignified black woman on this very flight, no one suspected the explosive chain of events that would follow. The real shock? She wasn't just another traveler. She was about to show everyone exactly what she was capable of. Stay tuned. It was a blisteringly hot afternoon at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The air shimmered with heat haze, and the lines at the security checkpoint looped around partitions like coiled snakes. Passengers hurried through the terminal, juggling luggage, passports, and the stress of making it to their gates on time. A sense of anticipation buzzed through the crowd, some eager for holiday getaways, others on urgent business trips, and a few simply craving the quiet release of leaving one city for another. If you paused to look up at the massive boards overhead, you would see Flight De-escalation 198 bound for Los Angeles, the first-class cabin fully booked. Among the throngs of travelers, a well-dressed man named Trevor Wilcox slipped through the terminal with ease. He wore a smart, navy blue suit and a tie that shimmered with subtle stripes in the fluorescent light. His leather carry-on looked expensive enough to buy a second-hand car. Trevor's demeanor exuded confidence, a confidence that had grown over the years as he rose in his company to become a top executive at a high-end tech firm. He scanned the Delta Airlines signage and finally spotted the gate for his flight, De-escalation 198, departing in just under an hour. Despite the bustle around him, Trevor prided himself on efficiency. He had pre-check, first-class priority boarding, and the unwavering certainty that he deserved the best treatment. He was known among his colleagues for his outspoken nature. Praise or complaint would roll off his tongue without hesitation. Stepping into the terminal lounge reserved for first-class passengers, he felt a smug thrill seeing others pressed together on uncomfortable benches by the gate. In here, he would sip a complimentary cappuccino before heading to his seat in the exclusive forward cabin. Outside the windows, a 757 glinted in the midday sun. Ground crews bustled around, loading cargo and ensuring everything was in perfect order. The cabin crew, including flight attendants who were veterans in handling all manner of airborne drama, prepared meticulously for departure. Meanwhile, gate agents politely checked in passengers, some of whom grumbled about overhead bin space or boarding times. Yet if you were to look closely, you'd see that not everyone in the first-class lounge was there for luxurious comfort alone. A tall, poised black woman named Adriana sat near the large glass wall, reading a magazine she pretended to find enthralling. Her posture was upright, and her gaze occasionally flitted around the room. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, rather than the more opulent ensembles favored by many first-class flyers. Indeed, her attire was intentionally designed to help her blend in a lesson she had learned from training in discreet observation. Adriana, in fact, was not a typical passenger. Officially registered under an alias with Delta Airlines, she was an undercover air marshal. Over the years, she had worked tirelessly to protect unsuspecting passengers from potential threats. She'd been on flights where bombs were threatened, belligerent passengers had to be subdued, and even medical emergencies tested her composure. Yet it was routine flights like this, one spanning from New York to Los Angeles, that sometimes presented the most unexpected personal drama. And though she had faced real criminal threats, she found that prejudice and bigotry could be just as explosive when left unchecked. Trevor Wilcox left the first-class lounge at the final call for boarding. He had timed it perfectly, no need to be crammed into the jetway, no more idle small talk with strangers. He floated directly to the gate agent, flashed his boarding pass, and stepped onto the aircraft. He loved the moment when he'd step from the jet bridge into the wide aisle of first class. Flight attendants with perfect smiles greeted him, offering to take his jacket and hand him a welcome beverage. He graciously accepted a cold glass of orange juice, ignoring the fact that other passengers in the economy queue behind him looked weary and anxious. As Trevor settled into seat 2A, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. Flying first class was one of the perks he believed he'd earned for a lifetime. Sure, the cost was high, but it was always worth it to feel superior, even if he wouldn't openly admit it. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, taking up most of the space designated for 2 seats. He noticed a petite woman in seat 2B glance at his bag, but Trevor shrugged it off, ignoring her mild annoyance. Adriana Charles boarded last, as was her typical routine. She carried only a modest tote bag and wore sensible shoes that could allow her to move quickly if necessary. The flight attendants recognized her from their briefing. Air Marshals always informed the cabin crew of their identity in confidence. Adriana offered them a friendly nod before making her way to seat 3A. Strategically, she preferred a window seat in the first-class section because it gave her a good vantage point of the entire cabin, including the cockpit door. She passed by Trevor, who casually glanced at her. Something shifted in his expression. Maybe it was the subtle authority in her stride or the intensity in her eyes, but it unsettled him. He quickly masked it, however, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Adriana, attuned to micro-expressions through her training, sensed an undercurrent of condescension. She pressed her lips together in a polite smile, then continued to her seat. "Welcome aboard, Miss Johnson," said a flight attendant, using Adriana's alias. "We'll be departing shortly." "Thank you," Adriana replied, her voice composed. She settled in and discreetly observed the cabin. Nearby, Trevor scrolled on his phone with purposeful swipes, glancing occasionally at the other passengers in first class. A mother and her teenage daughter in seats 1C and 1D were chatting excitedly. A middle-aged couple, seats 3B and 4B, looked anxious and exhausted, perhaps traveling for a funeral or a medical procedure. And then there was a solitary figure in seat 4A, a man reading a newspaper who seemed deep in thought. The cabin door closed with a firm click, and the flight attendants gave safety instructions with the usual routine. Trevor yawned loudly, earning a few disapproving stares, but he hardly noticed. Within minutes, the aircraft taxied onto the runway, its engines roaring to life. Adriana leaned back in her seat, already anticipating how to keep an eye on Trevor. Something about him told her this flight might not remain peaceful for long. The seatbelt sign blinked off after the plane reached cruising altitude of about 3,500 feet. A flight attendant glided through the aisle offering beverages. Trevor ordered a whiskey on the rocks, giving the attendant a condescending wink. Adriana asked for water, politely declining any alcohol since she needed her senses sharp. Conversation in the first-class cabin was subdued at first. Passengers scrolled through in-flight entertainment menus, read books, or tried to doze. Trevor, however, seemed restless. He began to sigh heavily, as though annoyed by the slightest inconvenience. He flagged down a flight attendant to complain that his seatbelt sign light was flickering. The flight attendant apologized, promising to look into it. He then noticed that the passenger in seat 2B, a well-groomed woman in business casual attire, was trying to retrieve something from the overhead bin. Trevor rolled his eyes, muttering that she was blocking his personal space. When she bumped his elbow by accident, he snapped, "Watch it!" She stammered an apology before hurrying back to her seat, appearing clearly rattled. Adriana's gaze flickered from her phone to Trevor. From her vantage point, his tone dripped with superiority. This wasn't an isolated incident, she noted. Sometimes being an air marshal wasn't just about staving off hijackers or dealing with bombs. It was also about de-escalating personal conflicts that could spiral out of control. She calmly sipped her water, mentally cataloguing Trevor's behavior. In an effort to keep a discreet watch, Adriana got up to stretch her legs. She walked the length of first class, politely smiling at those she passed. Reaching the galley, she had a brief conversation with a flight attendant she recognized from the pre-flight briefing. "How's the cabin so far?" the attendant asked, her voice low to avoid disturbing other passengers. "The man in 2A, Trevor Wilcox," Adriana replied quietly. "He's agitated. Doesn't pose an immediate threat, but keep an eye out for any escalation," the flight attendant nodded. "He's already complained twice about small things. We'll keep you in the loop." Adriana thanked her and made her way back to seat 3A. As she passed Trevor, he barely shifted his legs to let her through, even though she gave him a polite "excuse me." She noticed his eyes narrow at her, as though he were silently assessing her. Adriana had encountered this type before, individuals who believed themselves entitled to control a shared space and who became downright hostile if their sense of entitlement was challenged. She ignored the tension for now, sinking back into her seat. It happened nearly 2 hours into the flight. Trevor had just finished his second glass of whiskey, his cheeks growing flush. The flight attendants began serving lunch. In first class, even on a domestic flight, passengers enjoyed a plated meal with metal utensils and a choice of entree. Trevor received his meal first. As he cut into his chicken breast, he noticed the sauce was a bit too spicy for his taste. He pressed the call button. "Sir, how may I help you?" The flight attendant's smile was professional, but tinged with worry. She already suspected that Trevor had another complaint up his sleeve. "This sauce is ridiculous. It's entirely too hot," Trevor exclaimed, brandishing his fork like an accusation. "Do you have something else? Something that isn't going to set my mouth on fire?" She apologized and offered to bring him the vegetarian pasta option. He sighed and waved dismissively. "Fine, bring it quickly, please." The flight attendant retreated, offering a sympathetic glance to the other passengers who had overheard the exchange. In seat 2B, the woman rummaging in her overhead bin earlier had begun her meal too. Trevor eyed her dish. "What is that you have?" he asked abruptly. She replied politely. "It's salmon with a lemon butter sauce. It's quite good." Trevor rolled his eyes. "Lucky you." The woman quickly fell silent, turning her focus to her tray. She didn't want to fan any flames. Adriana, close enough to catch every word, felt a protective twinge, but remained outwardly calm. The flight attendant arrived with Trevor's new meal. This time, it seemed to meet his standards, or at least he didn't immediately complain. The plane soared on, crossing over the Midwestern skies. A slight turbulence rattled the cabin, causing the lights to flicker momentarily. Some passengers paused their reading or in-flight entertainment, but the flight soon stabilized. The pilot's voice crackled over the speakers, informing everyone to stay seated with seatbelts fastened for a few minutes. Trevor, though, decided he needed to use the lavatory at that exact moment. He pressed the call button again. "Yes, Mr. Wilcox?" asked the same flight attendant, bending down to hear him over the hum of the engines. "I need to use the restroom," Trevor said, annoyance etched into his voice. "I'm sorry, sir, but the seatbelt sign is on due to turbulence." "The captain has asked." "I'm aware of what the captain asked," Trevor cut her off. "But I'm telling you, I need to go now. Are you going to make me beg?" Adriana caught the flight attendant's eye from behind Trevor. The attendant looked exasperated, but tried once more. "Sir, it's for your own safety." The turbulence might be sudden, then I'll hold on to the walls, Trevor snapped. I'm not a child. I can walk carefully. Before the flight attendant could protest further, Trevor stood up, ignoring the slight jostle of the plane, and made his way to the lavatory at the front of the cabin. The flight attendant, clearly not wanting a confrontation, stepped aside, but Adriana quietly stood as well, moving closer to the aisle to observe. If Trevor stumbled, she'd assist him. If he caused more trouble, she was ready to intervene. However, he made it to the lavatory without incident. Once inside, he lingered longer than necessary, as if escaping the public space. When he returned, the seatbelt sign was still on, and the flight attendant shot him a stern but controlled look. He ignored her, though, and flopped back into his seat with the grace of a sulking child. Adriana slowly returned to her seat, senses still on alert. The flight was scheduled to be 5.5 hours total. Turbulence eventually subsided, and passengers resumed their usual in-flight routine. Some napped, others watched movies. Trevor, perhaps bolstered by the whiskey, decided to open his laptop. He typed furiously, occasionally cursing under his breath. The passenger in 2B tried not to notice, but she was within earshot. Adriana resumed reading her magazine, all the while keeping a keen eye on Trevor's body language. The flight attendants began another beverage service about 3 hours into the flight. Trevor asked for yet another whiskey. The flight attendant, concerned for his level of intoxication, tried to politely suggest coffee. "We have a lovely brew, sir," she offered with a practiced smile. Trevor's face darkened. "I don't recall ordering coffee. Is there a reason you're telling me what to drink?" She quickly backtracked. "Of course not, sir. I just thought you might enjoy. I know exactly what I enjoy," he snapped. "Bring me another whiskey, or maybe you'd prefer if I speak to the purser about your service." The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded. "Right away, sir." She turned on her heel, retrieving the whiskey from the galley. Adriana felt her pulse quicken. In her role, she had authority to intervene if a passenger was causing a safety threat, including if they were intoxicated. However, Trevor was not physically threatening anyone, yet just being extremely rude and borderline harassing. If he escalated further, though, she might have to make a move. A small announcement from the cockpit. "Folks, we're looking at some potential weather patterns over the Rockies. Might be a bit bumpy again, so please keep those seatbelts fastened when the sign is on." The pilot's tone was calm, but turbulence often made passengers anxious, especially those unaccustomed to flying. Trevor rolled his eyes, drained his newly arrived whiskey in one gulp, and shot the flight attendant another glare. Adriana was flipping through the In-Flight magazine, which featured an article on Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport and its massive capacity. She gave it a cursory glance, thinking about how many times she had flown through that airport on other assignments. Meanwhile, Trevor's restlessness found a new target. He had begun to complain to Seat 2B about the flight, the staff, and even the taste of the cabin air. The woman tried to offer polite conversation in response, but her patience was clearly wearing thin. Eventually, Trevor's monologue turned intrusive. "So," he said to the woman in 2B, "what takes you to Los Angeles?" She gave a tight smile. "I have some client meetings in Beverly Hills." "Oh, a businesswoman," he remarked with mock admiration. How progressive. She visibly bristled at his tone. "Yes, well, times have changed." Trevor gave a short, derisive chuckle. "They certainly have. Everyone flying first class these days, even the ones who don't look like they belong." The passenger in 2B stared at him, trying to gauge if she heard him correctly. "Excuse me?" Trevor glanced around as if searching for someone. His eyes landed on Adriana. Although she was behind him and slightly out of his direct line of sight, he tilted his head just enough to suggest she was his target. "Look around," he said, dropping his voice a fraction. Sometimes you can just tell who's out of place. Adriana lifted her eyes from her magazine, meeting his gaze for a moment before he turned back to 2B. The color rose in her cheeks, but her training kicked in. She forced herself to breathe steadily. An argument with a drunken passenger wasn't wise unless he became a direct threat to the flight's safety. "Is that so?" the passenger in 2B asked, her voice tight. Trevor shrugged. "I call it how I see it. Some folks just don't fit the profile of a first-class traveler. I can't help it if it's obvious." Adriana closed the magazine, methodically placed it in the seat pocket, and mentally ran through her conflict de-escalation strategies. She had dealt with more overt confrontations, and something told her that Trevor was itching to unleash a deeper form of disrespect. Before anything else could happen, a flight attendant arrived to collect trays and offer dessert. Trevor refused the dessert with a haughty sniff, but the passenger in 2B accepted a small cup of ice cream. Tension hung in the air like an oncoming thunderstorm. The flight attendant lingered a moment, sensing that something was off, but eventually moved on to the next row. Trevor turned in his seat to peer at Adriana directly. "You've been quiet," he said. "I see you got the window seat. Must be your lucky day." Adriana looked up calmly. "It's a decent view," she said. He smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "So, are you heading to LA? For business or pleasure?" "Just business," Adriana replied, keeping her answer deliberately short. She had no intention of revealing more than necessary, especially to a man whose intentions seemed suspect. Trevor continued, undeterred. "Business, huh? Care to share the nature of it?" "Not really," Adriana said, her tone measured but cool. Trevor let out a sharp exhale. "Fair enough. Not everyone in first class wants to chat. But you know, it's interesting how these days you can never really tell who is qualified for their seat and who just got lucky, maybe used miles or some promotional upgrade. I fly often. I know what real frequent flyers look like." Adriana felt a surge of anger at his veiled insinuation, but kept her expression neutral. "You think you can tell, do you?" she asked mildly. "Oh, I'm usually right." His tone dripped with smugness. "It's easy to spot who belongs and who doesn't." Adriana locked eyes with him. In her training, she'd learned the power of calm confrontation. "Maybe you shouldn't assume," she said quietly. Trevor shrugged, turning back in his seat as if the conversation bored him. "Just a personal observation." Adriana stared at the back of his head, reminded of countless times she, her friends, or even strangers had experienced subtle or overt racism. She clenched her jaw. Was it worth challenging him directly right now? Probably not, as long as no one was in immediate danger. Still, she felt that pang of righteous indignation. In seat 2B, the woman silently mouthed wow to Adriana. She clearly registered the hostility in Trevor's words. Adriana gave a small nod, trying to convey that she had it under control. But the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Several passengers seemed to sense something was off, although none were entirely sure of the details. The flight continued. By hour 4, the cabin lights dimmed slightly to allow passengers some rest. Trevor dozed off for a while, though he would occasionally jolt awake, apparently still uneasy. Adriana took the opportunity to stretch her legs again, walking to the economy section to get a sense of the overall atmosphere. She saw families with children, college students, and a few businessmen in shirts and ties. Most folks were calm, reading or watching movies, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the first-class cabin. Adriana discreetly nodded at another Air Marshal stationed further back on rare occasions. There could be more than one on a flight, especially if there were heightened security concerns. But she was the only one assigned to the forward cabin. She returned to her seat as the plane began its gradual descent, indicated by the pilot's announcement that they would be starting their approach into Los Angeles soon. Shortly after that announcement, Trevor woke up and pressed the call button again. The same flight attendant came over, looking physically and emotionally drained. "Yes, Mr. Wilcox." He rubbed his eyes, glancing around. "What time are we landing? We should be on the ground in about 30 minutes, sir," he groaned. "Feels like we've been on here forever. I thought first class was supposed to be more comfortable. This seat is stiff, the food is subpar, and the service—" He shot the attendant a pointed look. "Well, let's just say I've had better." The flight attendant forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry to hear you're not satisfied, sir. Is there anything I can get you before we begin our final descent? Water or coffee?" He waved her off. No, just get me a feedback form or something. I have quite a lot to say." Adriana noticed the flight attendant's composure was unraveling. She nearly whispered to Adriana, "I've never seen someone so rude for no reason." Adriana gave a subtle nod of understanding, but there was no immediate cause for her to intervene. Just as the cabin prepared for descent, seat 2B's occupant needed to use the restroom. She politely excused herself past Trevor. He made a show of rolling his eyes and not budging much, so she had to squeeze by awkwardly. Adriana could tell the woman was doing her best to ignore him, but it was a trying experience. When the woman returned, that's when it happened. She accidentally stepped on Trevor's polished shoe as she maneuvered around his legs. Trevor let out a dramatic yelp, yanking his foot away. "Watch where you're going," he barked. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, genuinely apologetic. "There's just not much room, he repeated, his voice growing louder. "We're in first class. In case you forgot." "I didn't forget. I said I'm sorry," she replied, trying to remain calm. He shook his head and then turned to Adriana, as though expecting her to back him up. "Can you believe this? No respect." Adriana spoke softly but firmly. "It was an accident. There's no need to make a scene." Trevor scoffed. "No need to make a scene? She steps on me, and you're telling me I'm making a scene? Unbelievable," he sneered at Adriana. "I should have known you'd take her side." Adriana felt her breath catch, but still kept her composure. She was on the clock, after all. "I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying you should calm down." "Calm down? You're telling me to calm down? Are you trying to start something, lady?" Those words hit the cabin like a live wire. The hum of other passengers' conversations halted as several heads turned. One flight attendant glanced nervously from the galley. The pilot had just announced final descent, so flight attendants were supposed to be seated soon. This was the worst possible time for a confrontation. Adriana inhaled slowly, scanning Trevor's face for signs of an impending physical attack. His pupils were dilated, his jaw clenched, and a slight flush crept over his cheeks. He was still strapped into his seat, but his posture suggested readiness for escalation. She quietly unhooked her seatbelt, intending to stand up if needed. "You think you're so much better than me, telling me what to do?" Trevor spat. "I'm a paying passenger, and I've had it with this rude, incompetent service and these clueless travelers who can't even avoid stepping on feet in a wide aisle." The woman in 2B whispered, "Please, let's not do this now." But Trevor couldn't be reined in. "I'll speak as I please. I've held my tongue this entire flight, but some people just don't belong in first class. They act like they own the place, with no regard for etiquette or personal space." He glared pointedly at Adriana. "Where did you come from anyway? I've seen a lot of folks in first class, but you? You look like someone who got lucky on a buddy pass." Adriana's face hardened. She rose halfway from her seat, mindful not to crowd him. "Sir, this behavior is unacceptable." "Keep your voice down." He let out a bitter laugh. "Unacceptable. You people always say that. Enough," Adriana said, her voice quiet but commanding. By now, the entire cabin seemed to be watching. A flight attendant discreetly moved down the aisle, but the seatbelt sign was on, so she was hesitant to stay out of her jump seat for long. Trevor's eyes narrowed into slits. "Don't you dare tell me enough. I am an American, sitting in a seat I paid for, and I will speak my mind." The problem with society nowadays, Adriana didn't let him finish. I said enough. She was prepared to identify herself if he got more aggressive, but she hoped it wouldn't come to that. "Stop insulting other passengers. You know what? I've had it with you." He spat out a slur, a hateful, racially charged word that seemed to freeze the air. Instantly, the cabin fell into a stunned silence. Even the hum of the engine seemed to dim under the weight of that word. Seat 2B gasped audibly, the flight attendant covering her mouth. It was as though time itself slowed in disbelief that he had said something so vile, so openly. Adriana's heart pounded. She felt a jolt of rage and sorrow blend together in the pit of her stomach. Trevor glared at her with a twisted sense of triumph, as if to say, "Yes, I said it, and I mean it." She inhaled deeply. The question now was, should she reveal her identity as an Air Marshal, or would that cause a larger disruption? She gently placed her hand on the seat in front of her to steady herself. Her voice, steady as steel, cut through the thick silence. "Sir, that language is unacceptable. One more outburst, and we will have a serious problem." Trevor barked a sarcastic laugh. "Oh, really? And what exactly are you going to do about it?" "You think you can intimidate me?" The flight attendant approached, face pale. "Mr. Wilcox," she said, "I'm going to have to ask you to remain calm, or we will notify authorities upon landing." He scoffed. "Authorities? For what? Telling the truth?" He turned to Adriana again, eyes blazing with that sense of unrepentant hostility. "People like you don't scare me." Adriana's mind raced. She had a protocol to follow in these situations. Step 1 was to remain calm, Step 2 was to attempt to de-escalate, and Step 3, if the passenger posed a threat or became violent, she had the authority to restrain him. Seat 2B was near tears. Other passengers in the first-class cabin stared daggers at Trevor. Adriana felt the weight of her own moral and professional responsibility pressing on her. This was no random outburst, this was hateful aggression. She took a deep breath, leveling her gaze at Trevor. "You need to remain seated and quiet until we land," she said, enunciating each word. "If you make any more threats or use that language again, you will face consequences you can't imagine," he snorted. "I'd like to see you try." The tension hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. At that moment, the plane jolted slightly as it hit a pocket of turbulence. The seatbelt sign was still on, and the flight attendant hurried to her jump seat, glancing desperately at Adriana. Adriana remained standing for a moment longer, scanning Trevor's face. He was leaning back now, arms crossed, seething with resentment. She sat down, bracing herself for potential turbulence and for the next round of verbal assault that might spring from his mouth. The pilot's voice came over the loudspeaker, sounding strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making our final approach into Los Angeles International Airport. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." Trevor stared out the window, refusing to look at Adriana or seat 2B. His pride bristled under the watchful eyes of the entire cabin. Meanwhile, Adriana had made up her mind. After wheels touched down, if Trevor tried to flee or caused any further disturbance, she would identify herself and ensure he faced the proper consequences. In these last few moments before landing, she allowed him no more than a sidelong glance, making it clear he was under scrutiny. The plane touched down, tires screeching slightly against the runway. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the plane. Seat 2B discreetly wiped a tear, looking both shaken and thankful the ordeal was almost over. Adriana unhooked her seatbelt the moment the plane slowed on the runway, though the seatbelt sign was still illuminated. She had special clearance to be mobile if a situation demanded it. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Trevor reached up to pull out his carry-on bag from the overhead bin. ignoring the rule to remain seated. The flight attendant instructed him to sit down, but he stood anyway, removing his bag with a look of defiance. The plane had not fully stopped. Adriana quickly stood and moved to block the aisle. "Sir, sit down," she ordered, voice resonating with authority. "Get out of my way," Trevor snarled, attempting to push past her. That was the final straw. Adriana's reflexes were swift. She pulled out her badge, the one she only revealed when necessary, and flashed it in front of Trevor's face. The small emblem that read Federal Air Marshal glinted under the overhead light. His eyes widened, confusion and shock overtaking his anger. "Sir, you are hereby ordered to remain in your seat until further notice. Failure to comply will result in immediate detainment," Adriana said, her voice clear and unwavering. A hush fell over the cabin. Even Seat 2B gasped, clutching her phone in wide-eyed astonishment. The flight attendants, relieved that someone with official authority was handling the situation, exchanged grateful glances. Trevor stood there, bag in hand, stunned. You're what?" he stammered. Adriana didn't break eye contact. "I'm an air marshal. You will now follow every instruction I give you, or I will place you in restraints and hand you over to airport security upon arrival at the gate." Trevor's face grew pale, the color draining from his cheeks, as if someone had pulled a plug on his arrogance. He glanced around, noting the expressions of shock from fellow passengers, then back to Adriana. The triumphant superiority he had carried throughout the flight seeped away like air from a balloon. "I wasn't aware," he muttered. Adriana nodded curtly. "That's the point of being undercover. Now, get back in your seat." He slowly lowered himself into seat 2A, swallowing hard. The look of sheer humiliation on his face was evident. It was as if the reality of potential charges for interfering with a flight crew or worse was finally hitting him. He stared at Adriana, but his eyes held none of the malice from before, only confusion and fear. The plane came to a full stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and the cabin doors were prepared to open. However, no one stood up. All eyes were on Adriana and Trevor. She turned to the flight attendant. "Let the captain know that we have a situation here. We'll need security at the gate." "Yes, ma'am," the flight attendant replied, stepping away to make the call. Trevor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if weighing whether to bolt the moment the doors opened. Adriana sensed his panic. "Don't even think about it," she warned, reading his body language. "It will only make things worse." He closed his eyes and exhaled, finally accepting that there was no escape. The flight attendant announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated until law enforcement officers board to assist with an incident. We appreciate your patience." A murmur of curiosity and fear washed through the plane. Passengers in economy had no idea what had happened up front, but the tension had them on edge. Some peered up the aisle, trying to catch a glimpse of the commotion. Trevor sank into his seat, swallowing a mouthful of regret. Within minutes, 2 uniformed Los Angeles airport police officers stepped onto the plane. Adriana stood up and displayed her credentials. "Air Marshal Adriana Charles," she said. "This passenger, Trevor Wilcox, has been verbally aggressive, used racial slurs, and repeatedly disobeyed safety protocols. I'm placing him under your custody for further questioning." Trevor slumped, his bravado completely shattered. The officers took his carry-on bag and escorted him off the aircraft, reading him his rights. Passengers in first class watched with palpable relief, some shaking their heads in disbelief at how quickly the mighty had fallen. Seat 2B exhaled, tears of relief streaming down her face. One of the officers turned to Adriana. "Thank you for your service, ma'am. We'll file a full report." Adriana nodded. "I'll come by to give my statement." With that, they were gone, leading Trevor down the jet bridge like a disgraced prisoner. A hush remained in the cabin, broken only by the flight attendant's voice as she thanked passengers for their patience and cooperation. Once the plane emptied, Seat 2B lingered to speak with Adriana. "Thank you," she said earnestly, wiping her eyes. "I don't know how to express." Adriana gave her a gentle smile. "You don't have to thank me. It's my job, and also my moral responsibility." The woman nodded, still shaken. That was unbelievably stressful. His words, Adriana placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know. Sometimes the toughest battles are the ones that don't involve physical threats, but emotional and psychological ones. Please take care of yourself." The flight attendants also thanked Adriana profusely. "We knew something was off about him from the start, but we never expected him to go that far," one attendant said. Adriana nodded. "He had a superiority complex, and the alcohol loosened his filters. That's no excuse, of course. He'll be hearing from the authorities about his behavior. Interfering with a flight crew is a federal offense." Word spread quickly among the airport staff, and as Adriana stepped off the plane, she was met by a Delta Airlines supervisor who offered his gratitude, apologized for the ordeal she had to endure, and assured her the airline would support any investigation. Adriana assured him she was fine, just doing her duty. Still, she felt the emotional weight of it. Yes, she had dealt with dangerous criminals, but there was something particularly vile about blatant racism at 35,000 feet. When it manifested so openly, it reminded her of how these issues were interwoven into society, even in the rarefied air of first-class cabins. She moved through the terminal to meet the officers at the station for a formal statement. Trevor Wilcox was in a holding room, likely undergoing a humbling interrogation about his actions. Adriana didn't relish his downfall, but she believed deeply in accountability. His vile slur, his disregard for safety, and his intimidation of fellow passengers had consequences. A part of her felt a twinge of satisfaction in the knowledge that his prejudice brought him nothing but shame. Hard karma had struck swiftly, a man who believed he was above others, dethroned by his own hateful words and confronted by a woman he had presumed to be beneath him. There was a certain cosmic justice to it. After giving her statement, Adriana left the security station, weaving through LAX's crowded terminals. She was off the clock now. Her assignment officially ended once she handed Trevor over to local authorities and recorded her report. She tried to shake off the tension, but the memories lingered. Racism, entitlement, and arrogance, she had encountered them before, but each instance felt as fresh as the first. Heading toward the luggage carousel, Adriana felt her phone vibrate. It was her supervising officer, checking in to ensure she was safe and to inform her that she'd be required to file an online incident report within 24 hours. She confirmed she would do so, then pocketed her phone. She retrieved her checked bag and then proceeded to the arrivals area. Outside, the warm Los Angeles sun greeted her, a stark contrast to the pressurized steel tube she had just spent hours in. She took a deep breath of the coastal air, trying to clear her mind. Nearby, seat 2B, whose real name Adriana still didn't know, was waiting for a rideshare. When the woman saw Adriana, she waved tentatively. Adriana walked over. "You okay?" she asked. The woman nodded. "I will be. I guess I feel sort of dirty after all that. Like I need to wash the whole experience off me. You know?" Adriana frowned in sympathy. "I do. It's jarring." The woman offered a weak smile. "Well, I'm going to try to put this behind me. Thanks again. And sorry if you didn't want to reveal your identity, but..." Adriana placed a comforting hand on the woman's shoulder. "I did what needed to be done. Get some rest, and I hope your trip goes well." They parted ways, the rideshare whisking the woman into the sprawl of Los Angeles. Adriana found her own transport to a nearby hotel, reflecting on how quickly a peaceful flight can morph into a battleground of words, prejudice, and pride. That night in her hotel room, Adriana sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through news headlines on her phone. A local outlet had already picked up the story of a disruptive first-class passenger escorted off a Delta flight by authorities. No names were mentioned, but the article described a meltdown involving racial slurs. Comments poured in from readers, many condemning the passenger's actions. A few asked what had happened to provoke him, but the majority seemed outraged that someone would act so hatefully. Adriana understood the complexities of human behavior more than most. She knew that prejudice often festers in private, only to burst forth when triggered by stress, alcohol, or a false sense of invincibility. Trevor Wilcox wasn't the first such individual she had encountered, and he wouldn't be the last. She also felt a sense of gratitude for her training. If she hadn't been on that flight, Seat 2B might have suffered that abuse without recourse, and Trevor might have continued unchecked. In a strange way, she felt as though fate had placed her there at that exact moment to ensure accountability. Her phone buzzed again, a message from a fellow Air Marshal who'd heard rumors about the incident. She typed back a brief summary, ensuring no confidential details were revealed. Then she closed her eyes, feeling exhaustion tug at her. Tomorrow, she would head to the local office, finalize paperwork, and eventually catch another flight back home or possibly to another assignment. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of relief and reflection, letting the adrenaline of the day settle. She thought about the look in Trevor's eyes, the moment he realized who she was. Shock, betrayal of his assumptions, and raw fear. She hoped that fear would lead to reflection on his part. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but sometimes facing consequences could spark change. Over the next few days, word spread throughout certain circles that Trevor Wilcox, a well-known executive at a tech firm, had been detained at LAX. The story circulated on social media, with some claiming he'd verbally attacked a passenger and used racist language. Others defended him, suggesting he was under a lot of stress or that it was a misunderstanding. But the official report from the airline and the Air Marshal service was unequivocal. Trevor had caused a disturbance, uttered hateful slurs, and disobeyed flight crew instructions. In the corporate world, his employer took immediate notice. They placed Trevor on indefinite leave pending an internal investigation. Stocks wobbled slightly as rumors spread about potential lawsuits or PR fallout. Fellow executives quickly distanced themselves from him, releasing statements that their company did not condone racism or abuse of any kind. Meanwhile, Adriana filed her final report. She noted the threats, the slur, the refusal to comply with safety instructions, and the potential risk he posed to the flight. The local federal prosecutor considered bringing charges for interference with a flight crew, which is a serious offense. If convicted, Trevor could face fines and possibly jail time. Sometimes people who behave like Trevor manage to slip through the cracks, but in this case, there were too many witnesses, too much evidence. The airline's official statement corroborated Adriana's account, and multiple passengers were willing to testify. Hard karma had indeed come full circle. Adriana returned home a week later, physically and emotionally drained. She lived in a modest apartment in a bustling city, far from the opulent illusions of first class. It was early evening when she set down her luggage, flicked on the living room light, and sank onto the couch. The world outside her window sparkled with city lights, but all she wanted was to unwind. She opened her laptop to check emails. There, amid the usual work correspondence and personal messages, was a note from Seat 2B, whose real name was Lydia Bennett. The airline had shared Adriana's contact with Lydia's permission, as Lydia wanted to reach out. The email subject read, "From your grateful neighbor in 2B." Adriana smiled softly. She clicked it open. "Dear Adriana, I finally got your contact info through the airline. I hope you don't mind me writing. I wanted to say thank you again, from the bottom of my heart. You didn't just protect me, you stood up for dignity and decency. People like Trevor may never change, but knowing that you were there gave me hope. I'd love to treat you to dinner sometime, if you're ever back in La. In the meantime, stay safe and keep doing what you do. The world needs more of it." Warmly, Lydia Adriana stared at the screen, emotions swirling. Lydia's gratitude reminded her of why she had joined law enforcement in the first place. This was the reason she put herself on the line, dealing with potential threats, insults, or hatred. It was for people like Lydia, and for the principle that everyone deserves to feel safe, respected, and valued even at 35,000 feet. She typed a short reply, thanking Lydia for her kind words and promising to reach out the next time she was in Los Angeles. Then, with a final sigh, Adriana closed her laptop and let the quiet hum of her living room envelop her. Days turned into weeks, and the incident on flight D-Lone 198 continued to generate discussions on social media and in certain news outlets. Trevor Wilcox's name became tied to debates on racism, entitlement, and accountability. Commentators on television and online pointed out that his meltdown was more than just a drunken outburst. It was emblematic of a deeper societal problem. The phrase "first-class passenger hurls slur" trended for a while on Twitter, igniting intense conversations about how prejudice still thrives in seemingly polite spaces. Many demanded a public apology from Trevor, others wanted him fired permanently from his position. A few extremist voices predictably defended him, claiming free speech or blaming cancel culture. But the overwhelming sentiment condemned his words and actions. One day, a short video clip surfaced, presumably taken by a passenger seated across from Trevor. It showed him shouting, his face twisted in anger, then cut to Adriana flashing her badge. The clip went viral on multiple platforms, amassing millions of views within hours. People praised Adriana's calm professionalism, lauding her for being the embodiment of grace under pressure. In that sense, Adriana unknowingly became a minor internet hero, though she avoided any personal spotlight. She had no desire for fame. She was content that justice was served. Nonetheless, the story circulated widely, reinforcing her belief that the job of an air marshal, while often invisible, made a tangible difference in people's lives. Eventually, Trevor Wilcox issued a statement through his attorney. It was a carefully worded document that expressed regret for any offense caused, but notably omitted the words, "I'm sorry." Instead, it employed phrases like "in the heat of the moment," "misunderstanding," and "taken out of context." It blamed the stressful environment on the plane and the unfortunate role alcohol played. The statement did little to quell public outrage. Many interpreted it as an attempt to evade true responsibility. His company's board of directors followed up with its own statement, announcing that Trevor's future with the firm was under review pending a thorough investigation. Rumors swirled that he might be quietly offered a severance package and asked to resign to spare the company further scandal. Meanwhile, the prosecutor's office continued to weigh charges. The FAA also launched an inquiry, given the seriousness of interfering with flight crew and the usage of racial slurs. Trevor's legal team scrambled to negotiate. If he pleaded guilty to a lesser offense, he might avoid jail time but face significant fines and mandatory anger management or sensitivity training. In quiet corners of the story, some people wondered if Trevor would ever truly grasp the gravity of what he did. Others believed the law and public scrutiny would force him to reflect in ways he never had before. Regardless, the wheels of justice and public opinion had turned against him with a force he never imagined. As for Adriana, She continued her assignments as scheduled. Days after the incident, she found herself on another flight, this time to Dallas. Scanning the cabin as always, she carried her badge discreetly, ready to step in if needed. But on this flight, the most dramatic event was a child who lost a tooth while eating candy. She helped calm the little one down with a few kind words and napkins. She reflected on the cyclical nature of her job, sometimes mundane, sometimes terrifying, and other times morally stirring. The incident with Trevor Wilcox fell in that last category. It was a stark reminder that while she was there to stop potential terrorists or violent criminals, she could also be called upon to handle the corrosive effects of bigotry and hatred. Seat 2B, Lydia, remained in touch. She sent an occasional message about how her business meetings went well, how she was telling friends about the remarkable Air Marshal she encountered, and how she'd learned a valuable lesson in speaking up for herself. While Lydia still felt shaken by the memory of Trevor's slur, she took solace in the knowledge that someone had stood up to him in that moment of crisis. On a personal note, Adriana felt a renewed sense of purpose. The flight had tested her resilience, not just as an air marshal, but as a human being who had experienced prejudice. She realized she was part of a bigger story, one of progress, accountability, and the slow but undeniable dismantling of harmful attitudes. The world was still rife with challenges, but each time truth confronted hatred, it chipped away at the walls of ignorance. Several months after the incident, Trevor Wilcox's case proceeded through legal channels. Ultimately, his attorneys negotiated a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge related to disruptive behavior on an aircraft, narrowly avoiding the more serious felony charge of interfering with a flight crew. He was fined heavily and ordered to attend mandatory sensitivity training and anger management classes. The company that once boasted about him let him go quietly, issuing a statement that they uphold the highest standards of conduct and do not tolerate discrimination. In an internal memo leaked to the press, his former employer noted that Trevor's behavior was incompatible with our values and mission, and continuing his employment would be detrimental to our corporate culture. The swiftness of his downfall was a potent warning to those who believed they could hide behind wealth or status to justify hateful actions. Trevor tried to salvage his reputation, appearing on a talk show to half-heartedly explain his side of the story. But his attempts to evoke sympathy fell flat. His arrogance still seeped through his carefully chosen words, and the public remained largely unpersuaded. He receded from the spotlight, becoming a cautionary tale of how prejudice and entitlement can destroy a career and tarnish a name. Months passed. Adriana continued her work, sometimes reflecting on that day in seat 3A of flight D-198. She never expected that a few hours in the sky would lay bare the ugliest sides of prejudice, only to reveal the power of accountability and courage. One afternoon, she received an email from Lydia. Attached was a photo of Lydia with her family at a holiday gathering. They smiled, arms linked around one another. The message read, "Hi, Adriana. Life has been good. My loved ones and I are doing well. I still think about that flight, sometimes not with fear, but with gratitude that you were there. You are a hero in my eyes. Whenever the first see a flight attendant or any security personnel now, I go out of my way to say thank you. Wishing you all the best." Lydia. Adriana smiled as she read it. So much of her work remained unseen or unappreciated, but in the quiet corners of life, people felt the impact. She typed a brief reply, wishing Lydia well. Then she stood up, packed her bag, and headed out for another assignment. Another flight, another chance to keep the skies safe. Beyond the vantage of the airplane window, the world spun on with its complexities, triumphs, and setbacks. But for one moment in time, at 35,000 feet, A line had been drawn against hatred, and Adriana Charles would carry that memory forward, knowing that every act of courage, no matter how small, was a victory in the ongoing struggle for respect and equality. Stories like this show us that revealing someone's hateful intentions can happen in the unlikeliest of places, even in the elite setting of a first-class cabin. When bigotry rears its head, there's no room for silence or compliance. Adriana's calm courage and her undercover status sent a clear message that racism, entitlement, and aggression bear serious consequences. Their confrontation at 35,000 feet is more than a dramatic anecdote. It's a testament that we must stand up for each other, regardless of status or setting. If this story moved you or taught you something new, consider sharing it. Spread the message that prejudice has no place in our lives. Hit that like button, drop a comment about your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on courage in unexpected moments. Let's keep learning, supporting each other, and pushing back against ignorance together.